They both smiled standing there. They both felt a common hilarity, excited by the moving waves and then by the swift cutting race of a sailing boat, which, having sliced a curve in the bay, stopped, shivered, let its sails drop down, and then, with a natural instinct to complete the picture after this swift movement, both of them looked at the dunes far away, and instead of merriment felt come over them some sadness. Because the thing was completed partly, and partly because distant views seemed to outlast by 1,000,000 years, Lily thought. The gazer, and to be communing already with a sky which beholds an earth entirely at rest. Looking at the far sand hills, William Banks thought of Ramsay, thought of a road in Westmoreland, thought of Ramsay striding along a road by himself, hung round with that solitude which seemed to be his natural air. But this was suddenly interrupted, William Banks remembered, and this must refer to some actual incident, by a hen, straddling her wings out in protection of a covey of little chicks, upon which Ramsay, stopping, pointed his stick and said, "Pretty, pretty," an odd illumination into his heart. Banks had thought it, which showed his simplicity, his sympathy with humble things. But it seemed to him as if their friendship had ceased there on that stretch of road. After that, Ramsay had married. After that, what with one thing and another, the pulp had gone out of their friendship. Whose fault it was he could not say, only after a time repetition had taken the place of newness. It was to repeat that they met, but in this dumb colloquy with the sand dunes he maintained that his affection for Ramsay had in no way diminished. But there, like the body of a young man laid up in peat for a century with the red fresh on his lips, was his friendship, in its acuteness and reality, laid up across the bay among the sandhills. He was anxious for the sake of this friendship, and perhaps, too, in order to clear himself in his own mind from the imputation of having dried and shrunk, for Ramsay lived in a welter of children, whereas Banks was childless and a widower. He was anxious that Lily Briscoe should not disparage Ramsay, a great man in his own way, yet should understand how things stood between them. Begun long years ago, their friendship had petered out on a Westmoreland road, where the hen spread her wings before her chicks, after which Ramsay had married. And their paths lying different ways, there had been, certainly for no one's fault, some tendency when they met to repeat. Yes, that was it. He finished. He turned from the view, and turning to walk back the other way up the drive, Mr. Banks was alive to things which would not have struck him had not those sandhills revealed to him the body of his friendship lying with the red on its lips laid up in peat. For instance, Cam, the little girl, Ramsay's youngest daughter. She was picking Sweet Alice on the bank. She was wild and fierce. She would not, quote, "give a flower to the gentleman," end of quote, as the nursemaid told her. No, she would not. She clenched her fist. She stamped. And Mr. Banks felt aged and saddened and somehow put into the wrong by her about his friendship. He must have dried and shrunk. The Ramsays were not rich, and it was a wonder how they managed to contrive it all. 8 children, to feed 8 children on philosophy. Here was another of them, Jasper this time, strolling past to have a shot at a bird. He said nonchalantly, swinging Lily's hand like a pump handle as he passed, which caused Mr. Banks to say bitterly how she was a favorite. There was education now to be considered. True, Mrs. Ramsay had something of her own, perhaps, let alone the daily wear and tear of shoes and stockings, which those great fellows, all well-grown, angular, ruthless youngsters, must require. As for being sure which was which, or in what order they came, that was beyond him. He called them privately after the kings and queens of England: Cam the wicked, James the ruthless, Andrew the just, Prue the fair. For Prue would have beauty, he thought. How could she help it? And Andrew brains. While he walked up the drive, and Lily Briscoe said yes and no and capped his comments, for she was in love with them all, and loved this world. He weighed Ramsay's case, commiserated him, envied him, as if he had seen him divest himself of all those glories of isolation and austerity which crowned him in youth, to cumber himself definitely with fluttering wings and clucking domesticities. They gave him something, William Banks acknowledged that. It would have been pleasant if Cam had stuck a flower in his coat or clambered over his shoulder to look at a picture of Vesuvius in eruption. But they had also, his old friends could not but feel, destroyed something. What would a stranger think now? What did this Lily Briscoe think? Could one help noticing that habits grew on him? Eccentricities, weaknesses, perhaps? It was astonishing that a man of his intellect could stoop so low as he did. But that was too harsh a phrase. Could depend so much as he did upon people's praise. "Oh, but," said Lily, "think of his work." Whenever she, quote, thought of his work, end of quote, she always saw clearly before her a large kitchen table. It was Andrew's doing. She asked him what his father's books were about. Quote, "Subject and object and the nature of reality," end of quote, Andrew had said. And when she said heavens, she had no notion what that meant. Quote, "Think of a kitchen table then," end of quote, he told her. Quote, "When you are not there," end of quote. So now she always saw, when she thought of Mr. Ramsay's work, a scrubbed kitchen table. It lodged now in the fork of a pear tree, for they had reached the orchard, and with a painful effort of concentration, she focused her mind not upon the silver-bossed bark of the tree or upon its fish-shaped leaves, but upon a phantom kitchen table. One of those scrubbed board tables, grained and knotted, whose virtue seems to have been laid bare by years of muscular integrity, which stuck there, its four legs in air. Naturally, if one's days were passed in this seeing of angular essences, this reducing of lovely evenings with all their flamingo clouds and blue and silver to a white deal four-legged table, and it was a mark of the finest minds to do so, naturally, one could not be judged like an ordinary person. Mr. Banks liked her for bidding him, quote, think of his work, end of quote. He had thought of it, often and oftentimes without number. He had said, quote, Ramsay is one of those men who do their best work before they are 40, end of quote. He had made a definite contribution to philosophy in one little book when he was only 25. What came after was more or less amplification, repetition. But the number of old men who make a definite contribution to anything whatsoever is very small, he said, pausing by the pear tree, well-brushed, scrupulously exact, exquisitely judicial. Suddenly, as if the movement of his hand had released it, the load of her accumulated impressions of him tilted up and downpoured in a ponderous avalanche all she felt about him. That was one sensation. Then uprose in a fume the essence of his being. That was another. She felt herself transfixed by the intensity of her perception. It was his severity, his goodness. I respect you, she addressed silently him in person. In every atom, you are not vain. You are entirely impersonal. You are finer than Mr. Ramsay. You are the finest human being that I know. You have neither wife nor child. Without any sexual feeling, she longed to cherish that loneliness. You live for science. Involuntarily, sections of potatoes rose before her eyes. Praise would be an insult to you. Generous, pure-hearted, heroic man. But simultaneously, she remembered how he had brought a valet all the way up here, objected to dogs on chairs, would prose for hours until Mr. Ramsay slammed out of the room about salt and vegetables and the iniquity of English cooks. How then did it work out, all this? How did one judge people, think of them? How did one add up this and that and conclude that it was liking one felt or disliking? And to those words, what meaning attached after all, standing now apparently transfixed by the pear tree, impressions poured in upon her of those two men? And to follow her thought was like following a voice which speaks too quickly to be taken down by one's pencil. And the voice was her own voice, saying without prompting undeniable, everlasting, contradictory things, so that even the fissures and humps on the bark of the pear tree were irrevocably fixed there for eternity. You have greatness, she continued, but Mr. Ramsay has none of it. He is petty, selfish, vain. egotistical. He is spoilt. He is a tyrant. He wears Mrs. Ramsay to death, but he has what you, she addressed Mr. Banks, have not, a fiery unworldliness. He knows nothing about trifles. He loves dogs and his children. He has 8. Mr. Banks has none. Did he not come down in 2 coats the other night and let Mrs. Ramsay trim his hair into a pudding basin? All of this danced up and down like a company of gnats, each separate but all marvelously controlled in an invisible elastic net, danced up and net down in Lily's mind. In and above the branches of the pear tree where still hung in effigy the scrubbed kitchen table, symbol of her profound respect for Mr. Ramsay's mind, until her thought, which had spun quicker and quicker, exploded of its own intensity. She felt released. A shot went off close at hand, and there came, flying from its fragments, frightened, effusive, tumultuous, a flock of starlings. "Jasper," said Mr. Banks. They turned the way the starlings flew over the terrace. Following the scatter of swift-flying birds in the sky, they stepped through the gap in the high hedge straight into Mr. Ramsay, who boomed tragically at them. Someone had blundered. His eyes, glazed with emotion, defiant and tragic intensity, met theirs for a second and trembled on the verge of recognition, but then, raising his hand halfway to his face as if to avert, to brush off, in an agony of peevish shame, their normal gaze, as if he begged them to withhold for a moment what he knew to be inevitable, as if he impressed upon them his own childlike resentment of interruption, yet even in the moment of discovery was not to be routed utterly, but was determined to hold fast to something of this delicious emotion, this impure rhapsody of which he was ashamed, but in which he reveled. He turned abruptly, slammed his private door on them, and Lily Briscoe and Mr. Banks, looking uneasily up into the sky, observed that the flock of starlings which Jasper had routed with his gun had settled on the tops of the elm trees.